Hi, I'm Harvey Hubbell. Welcome back to Show and Tell with Harvey Hubbell. And we have Augusto here. Augusto, how do you say your last name?
Buchweitz.
Buchweitz. And just tell me some of you're a PhD, but you have a lot of different titles under your name. Tell me your
Oh,
come on, just tell me
um,
some of them.
well, I'm a professor of psychology at the University of Connecticut. And I'm also one of the researchers involved with the Haskins Global Literacy Hub, which is a worldwide group of researchers involved in advocating and studying early literacy. And I'm originally from Brazil. I did a lot of my graduate and postgraduate training in the US. But I did come from Brazil, and I was a professor there for about 10 years before I moved to the University of Connecticut.
That's perfect. And you're gonna be uh, you're gonna be on the panel of our film. It's playing with the community lecture series in Bridgeport, Connecticut,
That's
on
correct.
April 25th.
That's correct.
That's cool. And I haven't met you. I'm looking forward to meeting you. But we're getting to know each other right now, and so is everybody who's watching this, getting to know Augusto. So I gotta. But why you could have done anything in the world? How come you got involved in studying literacy and language?
It's some of these things in life we don't, they choose us, I guess. And I would go back to my time as a visiting scholar doing my PhD at Carnegie Mellon, and I was working at the Center for Cognitive Brain Imaging there. And they had a multi-center study called Power for Kids, P4K, and Fumiko Heft, whom you know very well, was also involved in that. I wasn't really involved, but I got to see what they were doing. And when I stayed there for 4 years, and when I went back to Brazil as a professor, and myself and a couple other colleagues, we got tasked with helping develop a brain imaging center in southern Brazil. One of the first grants that we got was aimed at studying children with dyslexia and studying their brains. And we proposed a longitudinal study of reading. So it was kind of a perfect storm, which is a word that you like to use. During my PhD, my work was more directed towards bilingualism. I did some work with attention and multitasking. But when I went back, I thought that my chances to contribute and actually have a study that would have some impact should be directed at issues that were critical for Brazil and remain critical. And one of them was early literacy. And so we were successful in getting an important 4-year grant that got it all started. So that's basically how I went in that direction. And that study sort of snowballed into several other efforts and contacts, which ultimately landed me here at the University of Connecticut.
So I'm loving this. That I mean, you really are the guy who's working hard on changing the world. So
But
you come from Brazil, you come to Carnegie Mellon, you go back to Brazil with what you learned, but from everything you learned there before you came back here, what lessons are you bringing with you from what you've done in Brazil and how does it work connecting to Yukon?
it's, I think some of the interesting things that I've learned is that despite the fact that some countries like the United States have a lot more money to invest in education, the types of mistakes and problems that early literacy and teaching kids to read involve are similar to some of the poorer countries in Latin America, like Brazil. Um, of course, the degree to which the lack of funding has an impact in education in Latin America is also important, right? But you see that it's still daunting to me how schools of education, graduate and undergraduate schools of education all over Latin America and then still in the US and even in Europe are resistant to the science of learning. But it seems that that's only true, or maybe it's more true for literacy more than anything else. I think there's some spillover to math. There's a lot of misconception about teaching math, but in terms of reading, I always make this simple analogy related to the whole language approach. If you were to put your child in to have piano lessons, and the teacher comes in and plays Mozart, Tchaikovsky, and just says, just listen to the music. This will, you will naturally learn to play. I mean, maybe there's a handful of kids who will. I doubt it. I mean, even Mozart practiced really hard, right? And had to learn the scales and practice the fundamentals. You would not accept this, right? You look at that teacher and say, what are you doing? You come in here and you play music and you're telling me my child is going to learn to play the piano by just listening to this? Of course, it's important to listen. It's important to be able to break down the notes. But for you to do that, you have to break them down on the piano. To learn to read it, learn to do the scales, the chords, right? And you wouldn't accept that. Now, why do we accept this idea that children would just naturally learn to read in their own time when every single piece of evidence out there shows otherwise? So there's a lot of misconception. There's a lot of political issues involved in Latin America, especially. It's really hard to break through these walls because schools of education have been doing this for a long time now. So it's hard to come in, from an ivory tower perspective and say, you've been doing this wrong for such a long time. Like, people don't like to hear that, So it's hard to break that down. But it still amazes me that no one would accept this in music, or if you put your child in, to learn to play soccer or any other sport, if the coach says, oh, here's the ball, just go play. Wait, where are the fundamentals? You're not teaching them how to pass the ball, right? How to do these things that are not natural, because it's natural to run and maybe kick. But the fundamentals of a sport are not necessarily natural motor skills, and you have to teach them. You have to drill, right? And no one likes that word. No one likes phonics because it, comes with drills. It comes with supposedly boring activities, and they're not boring. They can be fun. And there's this resistance it's true to literacy. But if you would do it anywhere else, people would say, what are you doing? I'm paying you, we're bringing kids here to learn to play soccer, to learn piano, and you're just playing for them, and then they'll figure it out somehow. Of course, unstructured play, it's fine. I know people are going to say, oh, kids need unstructured play, whatever. But what I'm saying is, if we want to learn something that isn't natural, why is it that it is mostly for reading that we have this resistance to breaking things down and to drills?
I know that in the United States from the places I've traveled to, but you're saying the same goes to Brazil.
Oh my gosh, yes. It's even more so than here. In your documentary, you report that about 30% of schools and probably some of the graduate schools do teach phonics and the science of reading. I don't know what the number is in Brazil, but it's not even 10%. It's not going to be 10%.
But we're at a mystery here now, you and I, my friend. I hear exactly what you're saying about the music. I hear exactly what you're saying about soccer. I know that we as a species started learning to read 5,000 years or 7,000 years ago at the most.
Mm-hmm.
You have to read before you can. You have to write before you can read.
Yeah.
But it's a strange one. There's also shame about not reading.
Of course.
So maybe it's because we don't understand it. Maybe because the science of reading is just coming out right now, and we don't understand it enough. I mean, because I'm just going to go on a limb here, and I'm a dummy. I learned to speak by listening to what Mom. I tell her I want that soup. I want that soup. I want that soup. She tells me it's too hot. It's too hot. I'm like, I want the soup. I'm a kid, and then I don't know what hot is. So I put that spoon in my mouth. I learned a word. I learned hot. So maybe that's the reason naturally people just think. So these are barriers that we have to overcome in a lot of things, political, educational.
Yes.
So talk to me a little bit more about that. I mean, how are you going to combat that?
I mean, I think part of the issue, and this is also a mea culpa here that the science of reading and a lot of academia has a hard time communicating with, everyone else outside the university campus. I think that's one thing. But other than that, I think the science of reading has been around for a long time. And the National Early Literacy Panel, the first one was 1997. This is 30 years ago. It wasn't yesterday. This isn't really news that we know how to teach kids to read, right? And there's even misconception when we think that it is the fact that we learn to speak so naturally that is also, influencing how we think we should teach kids to read. Because actually babies, they break down the sounds into smaller pieces before they get to words. Like they babble, right? When they babble, they're not babbling library, right? They'll go ba, ba, ga, ga, ma, ma. And with time, those little pieces will add up and they will build words, right? They don't start with words. So why should we, it doesn't make sense to start with words because we don't start with words anywhere. Or what would be words in music, right? You don't play a whole line of I don't know what a word would be in music, right? I'm not an expert, but you first have to break it down to the notes, right? And then you make the whole piece. With sports, right? You need to learn some of the fundamentals before you can actually get into the tactics and the beautiful part of making these great plays and that people love to watch. Of course, some people are naturally more gifted at it, and the thing about gift is also something we can talk about because I think if you ask any great sports player, you watch the documentary on Michael Jordan, and he wasn't, he didn't just shoot the ball. He practiced relentlessly, and he made thousands of mistakes before he could make the shots at the right time, right? So in everywhere outside of this part of education, we understand that there's fundamentals that need to be practiced and drilled, and that's part of it, right? So because I don't want to go off on a tangent too much here, so you stop me if I do, right? But if you want to learn to read and comprehend the text, right, that's ultimately the goal, right? So when you talk about phonics, one of the first criticisms that you get is, well, that's not reading, right? Just like playing a chord is not playing a whole sonata, just like learning to pass the ball isn't playing soccer as a whole. It's part of it. And the way we need to understand this is our brains are limited in their capacity to do multiple things and in the resources they can allocate to what we're doing. So when we want to do something as high level as comprehending text, especially if it's text with new information that we have to integrate, we have to learn, right? And this is hard because when you read something that you have to, it takes time. You feel tired after a while. And if you're a fluent reader, you'll feel tired as well. Now imagine if you have to read a hard text and all of a sudden they give it to you in German and every other word you have to look it up in the dictionary and you're going so slow that it takes you 2 minutes to finish a sentence. That's true for someone with reading difficulties, but also true for someone who wasn't taught properly how to read, to the point that reading becomes something that it's traumatizing. And the essence of it comes down to everything that we want to learn at a higher level will require fundamentals, right? I like to give my students the following example when I teach cognitive psychology. It's one of the early scenes in the movie Sully, where he lands the airplane on the Hudson. And you can see how at some point there's a lot of things that he's doing mechanically. He's not even listening to the tower anymore. And they keep saying, "Oh, just land a teeter-board." He's like, there are all of these fundamentals that he has practiced so he could, land that plane safely, right? So high-level performance requires that we get past the fundamental things, the dummy things, as they say, when you talk about phonics, that shouldn't be taking up a lot of resources. Because if you're spending a lot of your resources breaking down words and reading sentences, there's not much left when you get to the paragraph. And that's what you see in testing. What is true about Brazilian fourth graders? That is also true about a lot of American third and fourth graders. When they get to fourth grade, about 50 to 60%, they cannot give you right answers about a text past the first sentence. So if you ask a question about the first sentence or the title, maybe they'll say something, they'll get it right. But once it involves reading the paragraph, only about a third of kids can do it, if not less. So what does that mean? It means that reading for them is a struggle to the extent that when they need to really do what is beautiful about reading, which is understanding the paragraph, the text, the many pages that you're reading, you're spending too much at the level of words, right? And you never got past that. And of course, for dyslexia, as you well know, that is also a struggle, and it will be a continuous struggle throughout your life. But if you don't get the right tools early on, and if you're not diagnosed as early as possible, and that's one of the conundrums here. And part of our experience in Brazil with a reading clinic that we had, it makes it worse.
Well,
Right.
what you said something about, so your numbers in Brazil and your numbers in the United States are just about a third of the kids are getting it. So what we're doing with this approach, a third of the kids are getting it. So I want to know what the major barriers to stop the widespread systematic literacy instruction. What
Yeah.
Because we're failing at this, and
Yes.
as you said, I mean, reading is enjoyable and it's beautiful and it can
Yes.
take you to these wonderful places. But
Yes.
we're only doing a third of our population, and so 2/3
If
of our
that.
population, if that. And so in the United States, I know certainly the school to prison pipeline is an expression because
Yeah.
the kids that are our brothers and sisters that are incarcerated uh, are illiterate and can't read, and maybe their self-esteem is in a thing. So
Oh,
what are these what are the barriers that are stopping us from? We have the science, we've had it since for 30 years, as you said. So what are the
sure.
barriers?
Well, it's, for every complex question like that, there isn't one right answer, but let me try to address it from different perspectives. And let me actually just give you recent numbers from Brazil. So there's this international study called PEARLS, which is the Progress in International Reading Literacy. And the US does a lot better than Brazil. So just so you have an idea, fourth graders in Brazil, only 11% are reading at the high level, only 2% at the advanced level, and 24% at intermediate, which is acceptable. 60% are basic or below, which means word, maybe sentence level, right? So what I'm telling you is that only about 13% of kids can actually understand text in fourth grade in Brazil. And the interesting thing here too is that if you look at these numbers, it's not just poor kids. There are kids from middle and upper middle class and even higher levels that are among these kids. So it isn't just about poverty. Of course, poverty is a strong factor, right? We cannot, for Latin America and for the United States, you will see that literacy numbers will always be worse among poor people. But what's striking to me is you will get these very expensive private schools in Brazil that are not doing well. And a lot of what happens, and I don't have evidence of this, but I only wish that someone would break it down and go into these very expensive schools and ask the kids, how many of you had to have a speech therapist or someone in first or second grade help you learn to read because you weren't learning? Because a lot of them do. And the reason the numbers aren't worse among higher income families is that there's more money and more time to address this. So what are the problems? I think they begin, of course, with very basic things that a lot of kids don't have in Brazil. So for example, only 20% of schools in Brazil are full-time. That means that go from 7:30, 8 o'clock until 3 in the afternoon. All the other 80% of schools start at 7:30 and kids go home at 11:30. 4 hours. If they're having 4 hours. So that's already there, that's a problem, right? It's not enough hours in school. And hours in school isn't about sitting in a chair and, having to learn, looking at a board, but you need those hours to do exercise, to music, right? And to be in a safe place, because most of these kids are going home to nothing. They're not going, the rich kids will have music, sports in the afternoon, and they will have activities all day, right? So that's one of the things in Brazil. I think full-time education is an issue that they're trying to address, right, and get to 50% within the next 5 or 6 years. And I think that's an issue in terms of the infrastructure. Of course, kids can't be hungry, so nutrition is important. But the interesting thing here, there's a study by the American Institute for Research by Rebecca Stone, and showing how nutrition programs don't exactly have an impact on early literacy results. Of course, what this means is, it's not saying that nutrition isn't important, but if you're going to implement science of reading and you don't have nutrition, then I think it would be a problem, right? Because someone who's hungry is not going to learn. Someone who's experienced violence and is afraid for their life is going to have a hard time learning, because a lot of their brain is dedicated to, I need to eat, I need to survive, right? What I'm saying is poverty is a factor, but if you give food, nutrition, and all these basic elements, they're still not going to learn to read if you're not doing the right thing. And there's a famous city in Brazil called Sobral. You spell that Sobral, which in the state of Ceará. And then the whole state started adapting part of the policy that the city did. So they invested in infrastructure strongly for education. They, improved the schools, teacher training. But the thing about teacher training is if you're still training the wrong thing, you're not going to improve. And so after a while, they realized we're investing all this money, and one of the areas that we're not improving is early literacy. And this has been 10, 15 years ago. And then they went after it, and they learned that they were not teaching kids to read the right way. So they actually hired this third sector company that works with early literacy and phonics in Brazil. And all of a sudden, their early literacy numbers just, they achieve 95, 96% proficiency in the public system, to the extent that private system kids went back to public schools in that city. So yes, there is an infrastructure issue. There is an issue of nutrition, of poverty. We can never disregard that. And that has to be taken care of. And I'm not an expert on that, right? And so I would never disagree that that is an issue. But the thing is, learning to read will still require that you do the right thing when you're teaching children to read. You have to make sure that you address these fundamental issues of nutrition, safety, mental health for these kids, and keep them in school longer. But you also have to make sure that that time in school includes a 30, 40 minutes of instruction that is systematic and that will follow the path of, this is how you teach someone to read. Otherwise, it will be great for these kids to be fed, to have a safe place, but our literacy numbers are not going to go up magically. So to answer your question, what do we do here? I think there's that whole issue with the schools, how teachers are trained, and that takes us to the schools of education and the resistance there to a lot of it being political, to phonics and systematic instruction. And I bet that if you would, study the curricula of schools of education in Brazil, graduate or undergraduate, I don't think you would find a significant amount of time spent on phonics and the scientific studies of reading in 10% of these schools. Most of these students will graduate and begin teaching children to read without ever having learned anything about phonics instruction. In fact, probably if they heard of it, someone said it's wrong, it's bad, it traumatizes children. That's a frequent one, right? And I remember hearing this once in a discussion, and my answer was, well, first I would like you to either bring me a study that shows that phonics actually is correlated with trauma, or bring me at least a child psychiatrist that will say, anecdotally, oh yes, I had a child whose, the reason for their trauma was phonics. Crickets. No, it's not true. It's the opposite. What does traumatize children? That they don't learn to read, that they feel stupid,